Steve in America, symbolic. Listen, thanks for the video response. I really appreciate it. And I like your videos because you move quickly and you flow quickly over lots of ideas and cover lots of territory. And you're also thinking creatively at the same time and thinking tangentially, which is great. Um, so that's good. So let me go over uh, your input, and then also you'll find me digressing and going tangentially too, because I really enjoy doing that. That's you know pulls the right brain in on things. Let me start with the French. Go to Paris, man. You'll change your mind completely about the French if you go to Paris. I could tell you the trick um, that sort of breaks through their resistance. Anyway, you'll like them. And you got to remember, man, without the French during the American Revolution, it's questionable whether we would have beaten England. Which is another way of saying that if it weren't for the French, we'd all be speaking English. All right. God, you brought up a really interesting point about states. What if a state were to, like Nevada, were, for instance, were to decide to become to become socialistic? What should the government do? And I think you're right. They would have that freedom. All the Constitution says, I think, on this matter is that the United States will guarantee each state a republican form of government. So if it was a republican form of socialism, it would have to be tolerated, right? So that's really interesting. Um, However, descending to discrimination, it's sort of, well, let me back a little bit up in the history because I think it's kind of different. It's a fascinating topic. We had slavery was abolished. I believe it was the 13th Amendment in 1865, after the Civil War. But what happened was the various states that had slaves did not grant people equal citizenship rights. They, for instance, wouldn't allow African Americans to vote, etc. And as a result of that, 3 years later, they passed the 14th Amendment, which automatically made everybody, and African Americans, therefore, citizens of the United States and citizens of the state in which they reside, and added a little equal protection clause, they call it, saying that every state had to afford, or every citizen had the right to the equal protection under the laws. So that's the equal protection clause, which those states then dodged by saying, okay, separate but equal. In other words, equal, but it's going to be separate. And then that was overturned by the Supreme Court in Brown versus Education, which basically said, separate is not equal. Um, but in any event, moving back up the line of thought, um, uh, you know, had the states simply honored equal rights, there would have been no need for the federal government to kind of step in like that. It always seems to be the same. It's part of our human species. Some group of people will abuse something to the point where they go way overboard, and then the government will step in and say, okay, there got to be laws. We've got to regulate this, and we've got to enforce this. They pass laws and they get the executive to enforce it. So it's kind of a way that we lose our freedoms, or we curtail our freedoms because people just aren't doing the right thing. I had an argument with my father was a private detective. And when I was about 16, I had an argument with him on the phone as to whether mankind was inherently good or inherently evil. And he was maintaining that mankind is sort of inherently evil. So I was defending mankind and saying, well, mankind is inherently good. So he says, well, wait there, I'm going to pick you up. He comes by, drives by, picks me up, drives me to a law firm that he did investigation for, walks me to their huge, vast law library, and he says, look at all these books. Every one of these laws has been passed because somebody could not control their conduct. They had to abuse somebody else. They had to go too far. They had to take over somebody's rights or abuse their privileges. And so a law had to be passed. So if mankind were inherently good, none of these books would exist. In fact, we wouldn't even need the law. So he sort of won that argument on technical grounds. So in any event, now what's interesting about the 14th Amendment, though it was passed, I think primarily because the slave states, after the abolishment of slavery, just they wouldn't grant people equal rights. It actually, because of the Equal Protection Clause, it actually is the foundation upon which a lot of affirmative action plans have been challenged. If they tend to discriminate against the majority, people of European descent, for instance. So it's very interesting. It serves both sides. I will jump to, gosh, I don't want to digress into one area that will pull me too far down, so I'll return to it. I think we should put the topic of reparations aside and sort of extract that out from affirmative action, because I think, well, anti-discrimination laws are clearly not reparations, and affirmative action plans are really not a form of reparation either. I probably confused those two concepts in my original video. I blended those, and they really shouldn't be blend together. I mean, affirmative action plans really are just a way to try to overcome discrimination, which has become institutionalized rather than an individual act. So it really is unrelated to reparations. Reparations topic for a whole different video, complex issue. So let's just put that aside. I'm going to jump down to self-reliance. Yeah, I think the foundation of America really basically put us on the ground of self-reliance in terms of self-governance, not necessarily in terms of resources, in terms of our self-reliance in obtaining resources. I mean, we're independent, we're interdependent as human beings and as a society. So I would say yes, one of the great advances historically made by the United States is it says that basically people can govern themselves. They can be self-reliant to govern themselves, but not necessarily when it comes to obtaining the resources, individualistic resources that people need. I realized that there were some flaws in my metaphor that I used, or my metaphor, but and it can't be pushed very far; it falls apart. So let's skip over that. But just wanted to acknowledge that I know that metaphor that I used of the body and the human system is not a perfect one. Pardon me. Let's see here. Yeah, as far as judicial powers, of interpretation, really, who else do you give the job of interpreting the law to? I mean, it's got to really stay with the judiciary. They're the ones with all the history. Let me digress real quick, by the way. I read a great book called Ancient Law, written by a jurisprudence expert, a jurist from England. Fascinating, going into the roots of law and discussing the difference between law and equity. Fascinating. And I think that, when we get down to affirmative action, the principles are more principles of equity than they are principles of civil law. It turns out that the roots of that go back to the ancient Roman states. They had so many foreigners and so many tribes. I'm just looking at the time. It turns out that I'm running out of time. I'll do a part 2 to this. It turns out that they had to sort of develop almost an international law and look for underlying principles, and they depended a lot on that for the Greek law of nature. Anyway, fascinating. But equity, I think, speaks to sort of higher principles than just civil code type laws, common laws we call it. I don't have time to go into it, but I don't have time to analyze it. But I think it's a slightly different vein of justice than typical civil law of torts, and what if somebody wrongs you. There's something more profound involved. I'm going to end this video and start part 2. See you soon. Enchanté.